that we abandoned when the Romans came. I have searched for those things that will restore this land to its rightful gods, its own gods, our gods, the gods who made us, and who can be persuaded to come back to help us." He spoke slowly and simply, so that every man could hear and understand. "Now," he went on, "I need help. I need men with swords, men with spears, men with hearts unafraid, to go with me to an enemy place to find the last treasure of Britain. I seek the Cauldron of Clythno Ithan. The cauldron is our power, our lost power, our last hope to make Britain once again into the island of the gods. I promise you nothing but hardship. I will give you no reward but death. I shall feed you nothing but bitterness, and will give you only gall to drink. But in return, I ask for your swords and your lives. Who will come with me to find the cauldron?" He asked the question abruptly. We had expected him to talk of this sprawling bloodletting that had turned a green veil red, but instead he had ignored the fight as though it was irrelevant, almost as if he had not even noticed that he had strayed onto a battlefield. "Who?" he asked again. "Lord Merlin!" Gorfethid shouted, before any man could respond. The enemy king pushed his horse through the ranks of his kneeling spearmen. "Lord Merlin!" His voice was angry and his face bitter. "Gorfethid?" Merlin acknowledged him. "Your quest for the cauldron can wait one short hour?" Gorfethid asked the question sarcastically. "It can wait a year, Gorfethid ap Cadel. It can wait 5 years. It can wait forever. But it should not." Gorfethid rode his horse into the open space between the spear walls. He was seeing his great victory jeopardized, and his claim to be the High King threatened by a druid, and so he turned his horse towards his men, pushed back the cheek pieces of his winged helmet, and raised his voice. "There will be time to pledge spears to the cauldron's quest," he called to his men, "but only when you have punished the whoremonger and drowned your spears in his men's souls. I have an oath to fulfill, and I will not let any man, even my Lord Merlin, deflect that oath's keeping. There can be no peace, no cauldron, while the whore's lover lives." He turned and stared at the wizard. "You would save the whore lover by this appeal?" "I would not care, Gorfethid ap Cadel," Merlin said, "if the land opened and swallowed Arthur and his army. Nor if it engulfed yours as well." "Then we fight!" Gorfethid shouted, and he used his one arm to drag his sword free of its scabbard. "These men," he spoke to his army, but pointed the sword towards our banners, "are yours. Their lands, their flocks, their gold, and their homes are yours. Their wives and daughters are now your horse. You have fought them this far. Would you now let them walk away? The cauldron will not vanish with their lives, but your victory will vanish if we do not finish what we came here to do. We fight!" There was a heartbeat of silence. Then Gorfethid's men stood and began to beat their spear shafts against their shields. Gorfethid gave Merlin a triumphant look, then kicked his horse back into his men's clamorous ranks. Merlin turned to Sagramor and me. "The Black Shield Irish," he said in a casual voice, "are on your side. I talked to them. They will attack Gorfethid's men, and you shall have a great victory. May the gods give you strength." He turned again, put an arm around Nemui's shoulders, and strode away through the enemy ranks that opened to let him through. "It was a good try," Gunlius called to Merlin. The King of Powys was on the threshold of his great victory, and that giddy prospect had filled him with the confidence to defy the druid. But Merlin ignored the crowing insult, and just walked away with Tanibers and Eorwith. Issa brought me Arthur's helmet. I crammed it back on my head, glad of its protection in these last few moments of battle. The enemy reformed its shield wall. Few insults were shouted now, for few men had energy for anything other than the grim slaughter that loomed on the river's bank. Gorfethid, for the first time all day, dismounted and took his place in the wall. He had no shield, but he would still lead this last attack that would crush his hated enemy's power. He raised his sword, held it aloft for a few heartbeats, then brought it down. The enemy charged. We thrust spears and shields forward to meet them, and the two walls crashed with a terrible sound. Gorfethid tried to thrust his sword past Arthur's shield, but I parried it and cut at him with Howlbane. The sword glanced off his helmet, severing an eagle wing. Then we were locked together by the pressure of the men thrusting from behind. "Push them!" Gorfethid shouted at his men. Then he spat at me over the shield. "Your whore lover," he told me over the battle's din, "hid while you fought." "She is no whore, Lord King," I said, and tried to free Howlbane from the crush, to give him a blow, but the sword was trapped fast by the pressure of shields and men. "She took enough gold from me," Gorfethid said, "and I don't pay women whose legs don't part." I heaved at Howlbane, and tried to stab at Gorfethid's feet, but the sword just glanced off the skirts of his armour. He laughed at my failure, spat at me again, then raised his head as he heard a dreadful screaming battle cry. It was the attack of the Irish. The black shields of Oengus mac Eirim always charged with an ululating scream, a terrible battle cry that seemed to suggest an inhuman delight in slaughter. Gorfethid shouted at his men to heave and cleave, to break our tiny shield wall, and for a few seconds the men of Powys and Siluria struck at us with a new frenzy, in the belief that the black shields were coming to their aid. But then new screams from the rearward ranks made them realize that treachery had changed the Black Shield's allegiance. The Irish sliced into Gorfethid's ranks, their long spears finding easy targets, and suddenly, swiftly, Gorfethid's men collapsed like a pricked waterskin. I saw the rage and panic across Gorfethid's face. "Surrender, Lord King!" I shouted to him. But his bodyguard found space to hack down with their swords, and for a few desperate seconds I was defending myself too hard to see what happened to the king, though Issa did shout that he saw Gorfethid wounded. Galahad was beside me, thrusting and parrying, and then, magically it seemed, the enemy was fleeing. Our men pursued, joining with the Black Shields to drive the men of Powys and Siluria like a flock of sheep to where Arthur's horsemen waited to kill. I looked for Gunlius, and saw him once among a mass of running, mud-covered, bloody men, and then I lost sight of him. The Vale had seen much death that day, but now it saw outright massacre, for nothing makes for easy killing like a broken shield wall. Arthur tried to stop the slaughter, but nothing could have checked that pent-up release of savagery, and his horsemen rode like avenging gods among the panicked mass, while we pursued and cut the fugitives down in an orgy of blood. Scores of the enemy succeeded in fleeing past the horsemen and crossing the ford to safety, but scores more were forced to take refuge in the village, where at last they found the time and space to make a new shield wall. Now it was their turn to be surrounded. The evening light was stretching across the vale, touching the trees with the first faint yellow sunlight of that long and bloody day, as we stopped around the village. We were panting, and our swords and spears were thick with blood. Arthur, his sword as red as mine, slid heavily from Chamre's back. The black mare was white with sweat, trembling, her pale eyes wide, while Arthur himself was bone-weary from his desperate fight. He had tried and tried again to break through to us. He had fought, his men told us, like a man possessed by the gods, even though it had seemed all that long afternoon as if the gods had deserted him. Now, despite being victor of the day, he was in distress as he embraced Sagramor and then hugged me. "I failed you, devil," he said. "I failed you." "No, Lord," I said. "We won." And I pointed with my battered, reddened sword at Gorfethid's survivors, who had rallied around the eagle banner of their trapped king. Gunlius's fox banner also showed there, though neither of the enemy kings was in view. "I failed," Arthur said. "I never broke through. There were too many. That failure galled him, for he knew only too well how close we had come to utter defeat. Indeed, he felt he had been defeated, for his vaunted horsemen had been held, and all he had been able to do was watch as we were cut down. But he was wrong. The victory was his, all his, for Arthur, alone of all the men of Dumnonia and Gwent, had possessed the confidence to offer battle. That battle had not gone as Arthur had planned. Tudric had not marched to help us, and Arthur's war horses had been checked by Gundlius's shield wall. But it was still a victory, and it had been brought about by one thing only: Arthur's courage in fighting at all. Merlin had intervened, of course, but Merlin never claimed the victory. That was Arthur's, and though, at the time, Arthur was full of self-recrimination, it was Lug Vale, the one victory Arthur always despised, that turned him into the eventual ruler of Britain. The Arthur of the poets, the Arthur who wearies the tongues of the bards, the Arthur for whose return all men pray in these dark days, was made great by that stumbling shambles of a fight. Nowadays, of course, the poets do not sing the truth about Lug Vale, and they make it sound like a victory as complete as the later battles. And perhaps they are right to shape their story thus, for in these hard times we need Arthur to have been a great hero from the very first. But the truth is that in those early years Arthur was vulnerable. He ruled Dumnonia by virtue of Owain's death and Bedwyn's support, but as the years of war ground on, there were many who wished him gone. Gorfithid and his supporters in Dumnonia, and, God forgive me, too many Christians were praying for Arthur's defeat. And that was why he fought, because he knew he was too weak not to fight. Arthur had to provide victory, or lose everything. And in the end, he did win, but only after coming within a blade's edge of disaster. Arthur crossed to embrace Tristan, then to greet Oengus mac Airim, the Irish king of Demetia, whose contingent had saved the battle. Arthur, as ever, went to his knees before a king, but Oengus lifted him up and gave him a bear hug. I turned and stared at the vale as the two men talked. It was foul with broken men, pitiful with dying horses, and glutted with corpses and littered weapons. Blood stank, and the wounded cried. I felt more weary than I had ever felt in my life, and so did my men. But I saw that Gorfithid's levy had come down from the hill to start plundering the dead and wounded, and so I sent Cavan and a score of spearmen to drive them away. Ravens flapped black across the river to tear at dead men's bowels. I saw that the huts we had fired that morning still smoked. Then I thought of Cynwyn, and amid all that bestial horror, my soul suddenly lifted, as though on great white wings. I turned back in time to see Merlin and Arthur embrace. Arthur almost seemed to collapse in the druid's arms, but Merlin lifted and clasped him. Then the two of them walked towards the enemy's shields. Prince Keenaglas and the druid Eorwith came from the encircled shield wall. Keenaglas carried a spear but no shield, while Arthur had Excalibur in its scabbard, but no other weapon. He paced ahead of Merlin, and as he drew near to Keenaglas, he dropped to one knee and bowed his head. "Lord Prince," he said. "My father is dying," Keenaglas said. "A spear thrust took him in the back." He made it sound like an accusation, though everyone knew that once a shield wall broke, many men would die with their wounds behind. Arthur stayed on one knee. For a moment he did not seem to know what to say. Then he looked up at Keenaglas. "May I see him?" he asked. "I offended your house, Lord Prince, and insulted its honour.